For the past couple years, I've been a heavy user of foldables, and recently, OPPO came out with the new Find N5, which, on paper, absolutely revolutionizes the foldable space with a shockingly thin design, a strong hinge, somehow a larger battery, and even a periscope camera, apparently without compromising on the chipset, charging speed, or other features that you'd expect from a flagship device. But is this all too good to be true? Well, I've been using the OPPO Find N5 for about a week now, and I wanted to talk about the differences between this and the very popular Galaxy Z Fold 6. Now, as always, my full disclosure, OPPO sent me this Find N5 prior to launch for free, and they're sponsoring this video. That being said, I will be showing real-world testing so you can see for yourself what this phone is able to do and come to your own conclusions by the end of the video. Can this phone beat out the Galaxy Z Fold 6? And in what ways does this actually put pressure on Samsung to improve the Z Fold 7 next year? Remember, if you're a Samsung fan, you don't want this phone to be bad. You want this to be really good because that's going to increase competition in the space. And spoiler, this phone is putting a ton of pressure on the space. It's a very impressive phone. Let's start off with the physical design. The thickness is clearly a major talking point on this phone. Side by side, you can see the folded version is 8.93 millimeters on the OPPO versus 12.1 on Samsung. And when you unfold it, 4.2 millimeters on the OPPO and 5.6 on the Samsung, making the OPPO Find N5 the thinnest book-style folding phone on the market. It's also lighter despite having a larger battery at 229 grams versus 239. We have the alert slider on the right side to switch between vibrate, silent, and sound mode. And looking at the back, the aesthetics are much more pronounced. It looks a lot more like the rest of the OPPO flagship lineup with that nice circular camera bump in the middle. And I say nice because when you flip it over to the back, you really don't get any wobble on this when you're in the folded mode versus Samsung put the camera all the way in the corner, and I always thought that was kind of an odd space for it because when you open it, it tends to wobble quite a bit. As far as the waterproofing goes, we see some interesting differences here. The OPPO is IPX6, IPX8, and IPX9 rated, so the last number is your water resistance rating, and that means you can submerge it, you can, look it up, you can see what the differences are with the IP ratings, but you can have like hot jets of water on this, all kinds of different water resistance. Samsung, on the other hand, is IP48, meaning we have the level 8 water resistance, which is pretty standard for most phones out there, and level 4 dust resistance. Speaking of hinges, the OPPO has what they call a titanium alloy flexion hinge, but both are really quite durable. Check out Jerry Rig Everything's channel to see how durable they actually are, but I mean, there's really no flex. I feel like I could use this, and it doesn't even really creak. It really does quite a good job, and I think that's true for both phones. They're able to stay open at various different angles, and they feel like solid hinges. Now, getting into the displays, we have some pretty big differences. Of course, the Samsung display, it's a great display, and they made it slightly wider this year, but unlike a lot of other phones on the market, they have maintained that narrower aspect ratio, so that's going to make the front display 6.3 inches versus 6.62 on the OPPO, so being a little bit wider. Feels more like a classic candy bar style phone, as Michael Fisher calls them, and this one is 20.7 by 9 aspect ratio. And a big benefit of the wider aspect ratio is that it's more similar to a traditional slab phone, which means that apps are going to look better on it. They're going to be more usable, nothing's going to be weirdly squished or distorted, and even if you decided to never unfold this phone, you'd have a very good and familiar phone experience just using that outer display. Inside, the displays are also both very large, but larger on the OPPO, 8.12 inches versus 7.6 on the Z Fold. Otherwise, they both have great displays, excellent brightness, 120 Hertz, really just nice displays across the board, but the crease is very different on these. So at first glance, the crease is almost invisible on the OPPO, but when you look closer, it looks like what they're actually doing, it looks like two smaller creases rather than one deeper, larger crease on Samsung. So you can feel it a little bit more with your finger on Samsung compared to on the OPPO, but again, that's a nice technology that I hope other phones start to copy. The less obvious crease is really quite a benefit. And while we're looking at this, you can also notice the reflection is quite different. So you have a little bit of a purplish hue of any kind of white lights reflecting on the OPPO, but it also really mutes the reflections quite a bit. So looking at them side by side, if you're looking at these out in broad daylight, you're going to have a much easier time with a less reflective display. That's mostly on the inside displays where you see the biggest difference there. The corners of the displays are clearly quite different. Samsung opted for the boxier design versus OPPO opting for the rounder design. So if you're really stretching your media out to the corners, you may prefer the boxier design, but for ergonomics, you may prefer the rounder design. So when you hold it, it's not really digging into your palm that much. And despite being a very, very thin phone, OPPO managed to pack in a better battery in this phone. So it's a silicon carbon battery, actually a second generation for them, and you're able to fit a 5600 milliamp hour battery in such a small, thin phone, which I think is quite impressive. Based on my usage, the battery life is definitely better on the OPPO compared to the Z Fold 6. Obviously, your battery life will vary depending on how much you use the inside display or what your brightness is and stuff like that. The charging speeds are also faster on OPPO. You're looking at 80 watts wired versus 25 watts wired and 50 watts wireless versus 15 watts wireless on Samsung. The chip on the inside, you're looking at the newer, which kind of makes sense. The chip launched after Samsung launched the Z Fold 6, so they both at the time had the newest Qualcomm chip, but you're looking at the Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Elite versus the 8 Gen 3. Both are very capable. The 8 Elite actually did make some pretty big jumps, in my opinion, this year in performance, so it's nice to have that chip in this phone. Both phones have a fingerprint sensor on the right power button. I have to say I kind of like how Samsung has it a bit lower. It's kind of high up on the OPPO, so you have to reach a little further to actually get to that. And the volume button is above that, so it's even further. I don't really have a problem reaching up there, but someone with small hands might kind of struggle to do that. But the camera's on the back. Of course, I mentioned the periscope camera, but obviously sensors and specs are not everything, so let's get into a camera test and see which one's actually better. All right, so starting off with the primary lens and then going to the ultra-wide lens, both of these are very, very capable in broad daylight. We have a nice natural bokeh you can see on these pine needles right here using the primary lens. This is not macro mode, this is just like your standard rear lens, but if you get up close to something, I actually really like these shots. Looking at some of the zoom capabilities, starting with this little greenhouse here, starting with the primary lens, zooming into 3x, you'll see they're both pretty capable. Zooming into 6x is where you start to see that periscope lens really make a big difference. Zooming into 10x, again, you can really see that difference here as well. And all the way, the max zoom for the Z Fold 6 is 30x, and so 30x on both of these, you can see a pretty apparent difference there. Then zooming in on this little rooftop right here, you're actually able to go up to 120x on the OPPO, and there's two different shots you can get with that, either with or without AI enhancement. Looking at the front-facing camera, this is a pretty difficult environment, a lot of backlighting here, a lot of details in the tree, so let me know which one you think looks better for the front-facing camera. Unfortunately, the Z Fold 6 does not have a macro mode with the ultra-wide lens, although we do have that on the OPPO, but the Z Fold does redeem itself with the primary rear lens if you just get close enough that you're still within the focal range, that you're not switching over to a macro mode on that lens. I think it does a really impressive job. Here's portrait mode on both of them. Leave a comment, let me know which one you think looks better. And of course, there are a ton of other camera modes on these phones. OPPO in particular is very proud of their burst shooting abilities to capture sharp images from fast-moving objects, and even after you take the photo, there are a lot of functions on both of these that utilize AI. So looking at OPPO, for example, if we go to any photo and tap on edit, you can tap on AI editor, and then from there I could do a photo unblur on this blurry photo right here. On this photo, I could remove reflections from a window. And of course, the features on these phones. Samsung has a bunch I'll get into in a second, but starting with OPPO, they have Zen Space, which I've always really liked on OnePlus phones. I use it quite often. There's also the very nice split screen format. So rather than just having side by side, which you totally could have, you could have two full-size apps or even three full-size apps and tap on the side and it'll switch between them. Just an easier way to do multitasking. And they also have recent files to make multitasking even easier. So any kind of like images or documents or anything that you've used recently will be in that folder and you can just tap and drag them over. There are a ton of AI features, no surprise here. We have AI Translate, AI Documents, which allows you to like summarize documents and change some things in the documents. Pretty nice to have that feature. Of course, AI Call Summary and more features like that. And the most interesting one on here is actually a compatibility feature with MacBooks, or really any Mac in general. And this works using some software on your laptop that allows you to, first of all, transfer any files immediately from your phone to your laptop, which is very, very convenient. So if I take a photo, you get a notification on your laptop and the photo is there, it's ready to go. You can also access your laptop remotely from the phone. If you wanted to, use it like a mini MacBook, you could set it up like this and have the bottom as a keyboard and the top as your actual display, just as a remote desktop. Getting into Samsung's feature set. Samsung DeX is of course a great feature that gives you a desktop interface whenever you plug in HDMI to your phone. There's also great compatibility in the Samsung ecosystem with the rings and pinch to take a photo, the watches with ECG. There is an S Pen option for the case. You can also use the OPPO Pen with this OPPO phone, obviously. The pen's a lot smaller for the S Pen though, so having a case on the back also kind of removes that camera wobble I mentioned before. kind of a nice feature, and there are plenty of AI features baked in here as well, including the impressive generative fill / magic eraser feature that just you can circle things, remove them from an image entirely. There's sketch to image, portrait studio, Bixby calling, and more than that. Getting into the final category here, which I would say is the longevity or the updates of these phones. You're getting 7 years of security and Android updates for the Z Fold, and 4 years of Android updates, and 6 years of security updates for the OPPO. As far as availability goes, this is a little bit interesting. Depending on where you are in the world, you may just not be getting the OPPO Find N5. Very unfortunate, in my opinion, that I would love to use this phone, but it's not coming here to the USA, and it's also not coming to Europe, according to OPPO. So that's my summary of how the new OPPO Find N5 stacks up against a very well-known and popular Z Fold 6. There's a lot that this phone does well, and a lot of things I would love to see, Pixel and Samsung kind of copy from this phone. Like the thinness is incredible. I like the hinge design with less of a crease in there. I think the aesthetic looks really nice. I think it's nice that there's less of a reflection on the display, but let me know in the comments down below what you like or dislike about this phone and what you would want to see in a future foldable. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm Michael Bryan, and I'll see you in the next video.